Hey guys, MoiDawg here, and today we're going to be going over Squad's graphics settings. This menu got a complete overhaul in V2, and as a result, a lot of people are not only confused about what each option means, but can't figure out how to take advantage of the new optimizations to help improve their frame rate. I sat down with Jet, an OWI systems engineer responsible for a lot of the optimizations and graphics settings in Squad, and we discussed everything from low and high-end PC suggestions, as well as solutions for common graphical problems. By the end of the video, hopefully you'll be able to have a much better frame rate, a better looking game, and be relatively bug-free. If this video does help you out, give it a thumbs up and drop me a comment below with any other suggestions or questions, and subscribe for more. But before we dive into that, I do want to remind everyone that I stream a lot of Squad on Twitch at twitch.tv/MoiDawg every Monday through Friday. The live streams are a lot of fun, so I hope to see you there. To start, if you didn't know, you can open up the console by pressing tilde and then use the command stat FPS to show or hide your FPS in the top right of your screen. You'll see a combination of offline and online examples here in my video, but do note that the best results will be from live games with completely full servers. As of V2, these settings update automatically the moment you press apply, so you won't need to restart the game or wait for a map swap to see anything take effect. Let's first talk about shadows. Out of all the areas in the graphics menu, shadows is going to affect performance the most. And the first thing you should do is see how your frames react to changing your shadow quality. If you're struggling for performance, this may help. However, far shadows has a significant effect on performance, and as you can see here, by simply removing far shadows, my FPS nearly doubled, going from 40 FPS to 70 FPS. Additionally, you might notice that you can't really tell the difference between the two scenes, at least in Scorpo. Far shadows are primarily for objects over 500 meters, and although you might not notice it in darker maps like Scorpo, if we take Yeho for example, we can see that the far shadows immediately remove tree-line shadows, which obviously helps improve performance, but also makes it easier to see. Contact shadows, on the other hand, are relatively cheap, and removing those as well, we don't get much of an FPS boost, but now the entire terrain is basically bare. Personally, I absolutely hate how this looks, and I think that the added depth contact shadows gives you, plus the realistic shadows you get with far shadows, is worth the frames on most maps. My suggestions on this is that if you're really scraping for performance, turn shadow quality down to low, turn far shadows off, and keep the contact shadows on, so at least the game looks somewhat respectable because the contact shadows performance hit really is negligible. For mid-tier to high-end builds, you should be relatively safe with epic shadows, contact shadows on, and if you're getting at least 60 FPS, far shadows on. Any huge drops, I would first immediately turn off far shadows and then start dialing back your shadow quality. Now, as we move on to textures, two of the biggest complaints I've heard of is that the textures look extremely low resolution, or you're getting massive frame drops randomly throughout the map. And the first place you should look to fix either one of these problems is the texture settings. Here, you'll see texture quality, anisotropic filtering, texture pool VRAM usage, and uncapped texture pool size. This area looks a bit confusing, but to keep it simple, this bar here is a visual indicator of how much of your graphic card's VRAM is allocated to textures. The better the textures, the more VRAM is needed. If you're experiencing the weird low resolution bug, you're most likely under the recommended requirements for Squad, and you'll need to tick uncapped texture pool size. This is common for cards that have only 2 GB of VRAM, but if you're under 4, you still may run into this issue. Essentially, your graphics card has only a certain amount of space for textures, and if you're under the recommended 4 GB, the allocated space isn't big enough for even the lowest quality of textures the game was designed for. So instead, you get even worse textures. Checking this box allows more VRAM to help textures render properly at the lowest setting. However, do not check this if you have 4 GB of VRAM or over, as this will cause huge performance issues since now your card is pretty much only going to textures and nothing else. A good rule of thumb is that you need to select whatever texture quality that gives you about 30% of VRAM unused, since this is enough wiggle room for everything else your card needs to do. I've done the math for you, so look below to see what quality setting you should use for the most common cards. For anisotropic filtering, this is more of a personal preference slider with no real performance impact, and it basically changes the filtering method of the texture itself depending on what angle you're looking at it. If you're looking at a wall head on, nothing will change, but things in your peripheral will look a bit blurrier the lower the setting, and crisper the higher it is. Personally, I didn't really notice much of a difference between the two, but I really had a problem with blur, so I tend to err on the safe side and try to get the image as crisp as possible, which is why I upped the number as high as it could go. For anti-aliasing, this is primarily going to affect how sharp or soft the edges of objects are in your game. And although it does have some performance impacts, it's extremely minor, and I would primarily just adjust AA depending on what looks best for you. With AA completely turned off, the edges of everything looks incredibly sharp and almost staticky. By turning AA on all the way, the edges have been softened or blurred. If your game has gotten insanely blurry and it looks like players are almost ghosting at further distances, anti-aliasing might be the culprit. This is entirely subjective once again, but I would recommend at least turning anti-aliasing on low and on 4 samples to prevent any weird artifacting or visual problems. This sampling number here is basically telling the AA how many layers of the last image to put into the current one, which some people may see as a nice and smooth image, but others may interpret this as a weird smudge or blur or even ghost. By reducing this number, you essentially reduce the images, which will reduce the blur. Personally, I found that my AA sweet spot is medium with 8 samples. Resolution scale can have a huge performance hit as well, and this is essentially super sampling. So the key here is to find a good balance between blur and FPS. At 100, you can see that these trees are fairly blurry, but I am getting well over 100 FPS, topping out at about 110. Now, if I change to 200, you'll notice that the entire scene is extremely sharp and crisp, but my frames have tanked to 40. Once again, since this is still fairly subjective, if you don't have a problem with the blur, you can stick with a resolution scale of 100. But personally, I've been having pretty good luck anywhere between 115 and 125. If you want to get rid of any of the blur and don't have too many frames to give, seriously, just try even 105, since that could be enough to give you that sharp and crisp image. Having these minor adjustments aren't too big of a performance hit, and something like 115 gives me plenty of clarity. If you're going for sheer performance, at a minimum, keep it at 100, since anything less than that and you get something that kind of resembles a painting for anything further than a few meters. While we're discussing display options, although some systems may simply work better in either full screen, borderless, or windowed, know that this is primarily user preference. For VSync, generally it is recommended to turn this off, but some systems work better with it on, and if you are seeing flickering due to AA, try VSync. It's apparently a very uncommon and hard to reproduce bug, but if you are having performance issues and nothing else is working, do toggle VSync on and see if that solves it. For particle quality, most systems should be able to run them on medium to high, and if you do have a higher end computer, it may be worth trying Epic or Cinematic. Do note that although Cinematic is extremely costly, it will add a lot of immersive details on effects, like sparks and embers raining down from a deflected MBT shot, as you can see here. This is where I am 100% on board with running at a lower frame rate, since I think these types of effects are just too good not to see. If you do have a higher end PC, try Cinematic and see if you can handle it, because it makes the game look absolutely amazing during firefights. Ambient occlusion affects how objects look when it comes to shading and lighting, and unless you are really min-maxing and want to see every little thing on the map, I would strongly recommend having this on at least low. As we can see here, ambient occlusion gives a lot of depth to objects, and by turning it off and removing screen space ambient occlusion, objects look extremely flat. I've also turned all my shadows off as well here, so you can see just how bare the game can look. Screen space AO gives shadows a little bit more depth and darkness, and although you can kind of tell when looking at the forest, I can notice this a lot more when simply looking at my rifle, and it makes it feel a little less fake when it's on. For AO, I would maybe swing between 10 to 15 FPS between having it off and having it on high, whereas screen space AO seems to be about 5 FPS or so on its own. Since no AO looks absolutely horrible to me, and I like the minor shadows that screen space AO brings, I've settled on medium and screen space on. Personally, I haven't noticed any difference visually between high and medium, so I'd rather save the few frames from that one and put it into the screen space AO. If you're really struggling for performance, obviously turning everything off would be best, but I would still strongly recommend that even on a lower end PC, having AO just on low so it still looks a little bit better in game. Realistically, the performance hit isn't that much compared to some of these other areas, and you can kind of base your AO quality on the textures. So if you are running low, medium, or high-end textures, you should be able to have the same exact AO quality as well, with screen space AO being personal preference. Post-processing deals with anything lighting, such as bloom, and if you decide to turn lens flares on. This doesn't have much of effect on performance, but if you are running a really low-end build or below minimum specs, do make sure to have this off. Anyone else should be fine with higher quality, and personally, I didn't notice any frame drops or visual changes between the options. If you're not familiar with lens flares, it's primarily cinematic and personal preference, and you'll get them when various light sources shine towards you. Motion blur is also purely personal preference, but if you don't normally like motion blur, but you're having frame drops or low FPS, you could try turning motion blur on as a sort of cheap anti-aliasing, since it will essentially smudge everything together, giving you a smoother frame rate, or at least it will look like a smoother frame rate. Screen sharpening, whether it's on 0 or all the way up to 1, has the same effect on performance, so once again, this is personal preference, and having it on should help make the edges of contrasting pixels pop a little bit more instead of blurring together. If you're still having issues with moving objects being blurry and ghosting like we discussed earlier, keeping screen sharpening at 1 will also help. Finally, brightness, contrast, and saturation are all visual. I don't really touch any of these, but I will admit that due to recording and streaming causing the screen to look a lot darker than it really is, on darker maps like Mutah Invasion V1, I may adjust brightness to 1.25. Any other map, and I think the game looks a little too washed out with this brightness. Now, I think we've covered just about everything, but to recap, this is what I currently have for my graphics settings. Do remember, as you look over this, I am usually not going for performance, and instead, I'm trying to make the game look as good and as realistic as possible, while at least maintaining 60 FPS. Lastly, I did want to mention that you could do all of this and still run into huge hitches and crashes to desktop, and instead of it being a graphical setting, it's actually your audio. If you notice you're getting CPU bottlenecked, or you're noticing a lot of these crashes mid-game, especially when there's a lot of effects or explosions happening, try lowering your audio quality from epic to low. This will reduce your directional audio quite substantially, so you will have to get used to that, but it's much better than having squad crash every other game. Well, I think that's just about it. If there's anything I didn't cover or you have a question about, please make sure to drop a comment below and I'll try and answer as many as possible. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more, but that's it for me. Until next time, peace.